They said my cooking was ghetto. Not to my face at first, oh no. They said it in front of my son, laughing like it was a joke. But Vanessa's smile wasn't joking. It was sharp and dismissive, and it landed like a cut. I stood there, in my apron still dusted with flour, and the room went quiet in a way that felt like a verdict. My name is Ruby, and I am 62 years old. Before I tell you how they lost everything because of their own entitlement, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe it's time for us to stop carrying everyone else and start protecting our peace. But to understand how they ended up with nothing, we have to go back to the years I spent holding us together, one Sunday dinner at a time. I have been the family cook since I could reach the stove. My mother taught me how to fry chicken so it had a crackle you could hear from the front porch, how to make collards that weren't bitter, how to fold cornbread crumbs into gravy because waste was a sin in our house. Sunday dinners at my house were a tradition, my way of keeping a scattered family tethered. Folks said, "When Ruby cooks, everybody comes." And come they did. Children with sticky fingers, old church friends who needed a place for Sunday lunch after service, grandchildren who thought my pecan pie was the best thing God ever put between two crusts. Over the years, it wasn't just food. It was my listening ear at 1 in the morning when my sister lost her job, the ride to a doctor's appointment when the car wouldn't start, the money slid across the table to pay a past-due light bill because we'll pay you back next week. My son Marcus learned to lean on me. So did his friends, his cousins, sometimes even strangers who had heard of Ruby's open door. I don't say that to brag. I tell it because it became my identity, the strong black woman who can do it all. And that's the burden nobody warned you about. People begin to believe you are unbreakable. I worked full-time, kept my hands in the garden, clipped coupons, and still made sure the house smelled like rosemary and baked apples when they walked through the door. I sacrificed vacations, skipped a mammogram or two because someone needed tuition money, and I smiled through it. I told myself I kept the peace because family was sacred. But family started to look like a ledger with only entries under debt to Ruby. Invitations to holidays were shorthand for show up, cook, pay. I paid for flights, I picked up dinner tabs, I covered babysitters, and I smoothed over fights with casseroles and calm words. The Sunday before that Thanksgiving, I cleaned the house from top to bottom. I called Aunt Lillian to remind her to bring her sweet potato casserole. I asked my son to stop by the butcher for the turkey, and I spent 2 nights testing the cornbread dressing until it had that exact texture my mother used to get, moist but fluffy, holding the flavor of the pan drippings like a memory. I bought extra because I wanted everyone to leave with a plate. I even booked time off work and rearranged my appointments so I could have the kitchen humming from dawn. There were texts asking what they could bring, and I answered with my usual, "Don't worry about it, just bring yourselves." I meant it then, because feeding people felt like love. But underneath, a tiredness had been accumulating for years like grease in an old pan. I was running on muscle memory and devotion, and I didn't know the weight of letting go yet, until that oval dining table became the court where Vanessa judged me. Vanessa walked in wearing that new coat, the one with the designer label everyone recognized. Her hair was laid just so, her laugh clipped and rehearsed. She didn't greet me with the warmth I expected. She scanned the room like she was appraising a set. She looked at my spread, the big iron skillet with macaroni and cheese bubbling, the steam rising from the smoked turkey, the collards glistening, and she said, loud enough for half the table to hear, "Oh, wow, this is so ghetto." It was the way she said it, like the scent of brown sugar and butter was beneath her. My son Marcus went still. I could see it in his shoulders, caught between his wife and his mother. Cousin Elaine tried to laugh it off, a little too fast. Aunt Lillian's face folded like a closed book. Vanessa continued, unbothered, flicking through a text on her phone. "It's not what people eat where we grew up," she said, smirking. "We typically do a more modern spread." There was a silence so loud you could hear the turkey timer ticking in the kitchen. I felt something tighten in my chest, not anger, not yet, but a long, painful recognition. That edge of being taken for granted, of your labor being invisible, of your heart being repackaged as background noise. Vanessa didn't stop there. Later, she cornered my son in the den, whispering about how we needed to uplift our image and how mom's cooking is sweet, but we can't keep doing the same old thing. She used words like gardens and heritage, but not with reverence. She used them like props. It wasn't just the words, it was the way the younger ones followed her lead. My niece said she was trying to eat cleaner. My nephew rolled his eyes and said, "We could just do sushi, right?" They were all on this fashionable train, clinging to the idea that anything that didn't fit into Vanessa's aesthetic was less than. It felt like watching termites eat through wood, quiet, steady, and destroying the structure from the inside. And below the surface of that Thanksgiving evening, there were other betrayals I'd been bearing for years. My son, the man I raised, had grown comfortable enough to expect I would fix things. When his rent doubled last spring, he called me twice a week, in that pleading tone. When the car gave out, he texted a photo of the engine and a bill. Could I help? I did. I wired money without being asked how he would pay me back. The bank account entries read like a map of my generosity. Small deposits, large disappearances. I was the safety net, and they treated me as such. Necessary, but replaceable. Vanessa's dismissal was the gauntlet thrown. What cut deeper was the casualness of everyone else. Laughter after the comment. Crumbs of disrespect scattered over my clean countertops. I felt like a stranger in the home I had kept. But I am not a woman who loses her head. I am a woman who prays, thinks, and then acts. When the laughter subsided, I went into the kitchen like I always did, hands moving automatically to clear serving dishes, to fold napkins, to set plates for people leaving. But this time, my hands weren't shaking because of the onions. They were steady with a new clarity. I stood over the stove and I remembered every time I'd put my needs behind someone else's. I thought of the time I missed my granddaughter's recital because I was delivering a casserole to an ex-sister-in-law who couldn't make it. I thought of all the small purchases I made for people who called me an institution when it suited them, but a relic when it didn't. I didn't yell. I didn't call names. I did something quieter and far more devastating for them. I stopped. I gathered my keys and I began to fill containers. Plate by plate, I packed the turkey, the cornbread dressing, the macaroni. I scooped the collards into aluminum trays, wrapped the pies in foil, and set the sweet potato casserole with its pecan topping into a sturdy bag. I closed the oven, wiped my hands on my apron, and walked back into the dining room. They were all there, tablecloth askew, polite smiles that would have once been familiar. "Where are you going?" Marcus asked, bewildered. "Out," I said simply. There wasn't a tremor in my voice. "I've decided to donate the food." Vanessa's face folded into something ugly, surprise, and then anger. "Donate? What do you mean, donate? This is for family." "It was for family," I answered, "and family can be fed another day. But not like this." There was a hush. I felt the weight of decades in that room, the soft expectation that I would always give, always come through. I thought of the thousands of times I'd postponed my own doctor appointments, the times my hands were too sore to scrub another pan, but I did it anyway, because that's what you do when you love. I loaded my car. People called out, tried to bargain, to cajole, to shame me into staying. "Mama, don't be dramatic." "Ruby, come on, it's Thanksgiving." "You're embarrassing us." Marcus stepped forward, helpless. Vanessa crossed her arms like she had already won. But I had a new rule: my dignity over their appetite. I drove to the women's shelter a few towns over. The scent of the city changed as I drove, coffee shops and diesel and a different kind of humanity. When I walked in with my arms full, the women at the shelter looked at me like I had brought sunlight. They were tired in a way that was not choice. They were tired from life's cruelties. I handed over the casserole pans and pies. and the ladies there cried and hugged me. One woman, a soft-voiced girl who kept tucking a stray hair behind her ear, said, "We haven't had anything like this in weeks." Another, older, with laughter in her eyes, asked if I could come back and teach them how to make the dressing. I stayed long enough to ladle out portions, to hear their stories, to wash a few dishes because my hands needed something to do besides hurt. I thought about how different gratitude sounded here, unpolished and raw, but real. It humbled me. It also made me feel sane. By the time I returned home, there were paper bags on the porch and a mess in the dining room. Empty plates, 2 cold bowls of takeout, and people circling like vultures. Marcus was pacing. Vanessa was scrolling through her phone. My niece was on the phone, organizing an Uber to take her to a friend's apartment because this place is a mess. They had ordered food, expensive food, from a restaurant that took an hour, and when it arrived, it sat untouched while people bickered about who paid for what. The table that had been set for a feast became a battleground of receipts and accusations. It was as if someone had flipped the lights and revealed how brittle the evening was without the glue of my work and presence. I had expected some backlash. I hadn't expected the speed of the unraveling. Within an hour, arguments flared about small things: who had forgotten to bring drinks, who had taken the best pieces of a side, whether we should have invited Marcus's in-laws instead. The laughter Vanessa wanted turned into clipped words, and then into silence. Without my food, my hands, my cushioning words, their entitlement bared its teeth. I sat on my porch with a blanket around my legs and watched them from the window. Nobody came to stop me. Nobody knocked the way people knock when they want to borrow a cup of sugar. That night, instead of replaying every grievance, I went to bed early. I let my body relax into sheets I had bought with my own name on the card. I didn't open my phone when messages poured in. I let them stew. For the first time in a long time, the quiet wasn't lonely, it was mine. Karma, or whatever else you want to call it, did not strike like lightning. It crept, as these things do, through the small cracks. Without my constant bailouts and organizational muscle, systems my family had taken for granted began to fail. Marcus had been mailing checks back to me in small amounts, and one month he forgot. The lender called. The landlord texted, "Final notice." Without my checks to cover the deficit, the utilities began to slide toward cutoff. Vanessa's carefully curated life showed the seams. The designer coat didn't pay the bills. The first sign was the mortgage notice that came 2 weeks later for Marcus's friend, a person who had used my name as a guarantor in a casual conversation and found out too late that my goodwill was not binding. Then there were the social invitations that dried up. People discover that when the stand-in matriarch steps away, the stage lights go dim. The house party Vanessa had intended to throw to show everyone what real entertaining looked like collapsed when half the guests texted last-minute cancellations. They had been insulated by my labor for so long that they didn't know how to organize without me. And there were the smaller, sharper consequences. The takeout dinners they had ordered that Thanksgiving went cold because nobody had heated them properly. There were fights about who would do the dishes. The grandkids, used to my desserts and stories, complained that the food lacked soul. A cousin posted a picture of her charred fish and tagged the restaurant. Remember to never trust them. And the receipts started to add up. Vanessa started to realize that an aesthetic doesn't fill a belly, and it certainly doesn't pay a bill. Marcus tried to call me back. He called 3 times in 2 days, leaving messages that sounded smaller and more human than the brash voice I'd heard before. "Mama, please," he said in one message. "We messed up. Can you come over? Can you help?" The tone was different. It wasn't entitlement this time. It was real fear. I didn't answer immediately. I sat with the messages and let the phone buzz. Later, when I returned the call, I heard him explain in halting words how Vanessa had insisted on a certain brunch spot and then had a falling out with the owner, how the bills had stacked up, how the family group chat had melted into accusations. He sounded exhausted in a way my money couldn't fix. Other things happened too. A neighbor who owed a favor couldn't return it when her water heater broke because my name had been the first one she would typically call. Vanessa's polished world showed hairline cracks. She had to ask her mother for help with a legal document, something she never had to do when they had been buoyed by my network. The shelter calls surprised me. Women I had fed came by to bring me cards and hand-knit hats, telling me that the meals I had left sustained them through a tough week. I felt satisfaction. I won't deny it. But it was quiet and not triumphant. I simply watched the natural consequences roll out for the people who had counted on me as an endless well. And then an unexpected turn. One evening, when the house was oddly quiet and the phone had stopped buzzing, I received a text from Vanessa. It read, "Can we talk?" There was a polite softness to it that suggested apology. The family had seen the cracks. Their pride had started to chip away. When Vanessa came to the porch, she looked different. She had her hair pulled back, minimal makeup, and the coat was gone. She stood on my walkway like someone coming to confess. Marcus stayed a few steps behind her, an outline in the doorway. Vanessa's voice wavered when she said, "Ruby, I'm sorry about what I said about your cooking. I was thoughtless. I could have let myself be pulled into the old script, comfort them, cook, fix. But I had learned something that Thanksgiving. I had learned that dignity means choosing your worth over everyone else's comfort." I met Vanessa with a calm that felt like marble. "Bless your heart," I began, and I chose each word with care, but I'm done repairing things that are broken because people refuse to learn how to care for themselves. I said it politely because I am not cruel. There is a rightness in being cold and composed. It hurts them more than any raised voice because it denies them the performance of my pain. Marcus tried to speak, to seat us at the table for a real conversation. He reached for his old role, the son who expected his mother to mediate. I took his hand for a moment, because love is not something I throw away, and then I pulled it back. They begged, they pleaded, they offered to pay me back. Vanessa offered a small, genuine-sounding apology that tasted like late regret. But apologies that come only when things are hard are hollow. I told them so. I told them I would be with them in a different way if they wanted to learn, if they wanted to show respect, if they were willing to honor my time and my health. I told them no to being their safety net. I closed my door on the old arrangement. After that, I made plans for myself for the first holiday I had ever spent prioritizing my own healing. I booked a weekend at a luxury spa I had been checking out for years. The sanctuary was soft, with eucalyptus steam rooms and linen sheets that smelled faintly of lavender. I had a treatment scheduled, a deep massage that kneaded time out of my knotted shoulders, a facial that left my skin with a glow, and a Reiki session that put my breathing in places it hadn't been for decades. The spa smelled like steam and citrus and something clean. There were other women there, some younger, some older, but all of them moving slower, learning to let someone else hold the energy. I let the therapist's hands do what my family never allowed, rest without the expectation of doing more. I floated in a saltwater pool with my head back and the lights soft overhead, and for the first time in years, I did not think about who needed money or who needed sympathy. I thought about me, the person who used to come last on her own list. When I sat in a lounge chair with cucumber water and a magazine I didn't have to put down, I felt a delicious, quiet satisfaction. The noise of entitlement seemed far away. I remembered the women at the shelter, their laughter and their gratitude, and I knew my boundaries hadn't been spiteful. They were gifts to myself and to them. I was no longer carrying the weight of being indispensable. A few weeks later, the family reached out with a tentative newness. Marcus had found work that required him to be more responsible. Vanessa had taken a community cooking class and posted a picture of herself stirring a pot with a small caption, "Learning new things." It wasn't about them changing overnight, it was about them being forced to learn how to stand. They still called sometimes, but now they asked if I wanted to come to dinner instead of assuming I'd host. They tried to bring something, even once a small salad, an offering of humility. I accepted kindnesses selectively. I returned to my kitchen on my own terms, baking a pie and handing a slice to a neighbor who had come over with soup. I volunteered at the shelter again, not out of obligation, but out of pleasure. Teaching a circle of women how to fold cornbread into dressing became a ritual I loved. Their faces lit up when the aroma rose, the same feeling I used to chase. This time, I shared it on my timetable. On a cool Sunday morning, I sat on my front porch with a cup of coffee that tasted right because I had brewed it. The house was quiet, except for the distant sound of a lawnmower and a church bell. I picked up the fork, tasted a piece of leftover pie, and thought about how protecting my peace tasted better than any meal I'd ever made for people who didn't respect me. I had been the family's backbone for decades, and they had leaned until they thought I wouldn't snap. The difference now was that I had learned to be soft with myself, not soft as in weak, but soft as in healed. The revenge was not loud or public. It didn't require spectacle. It required a refusal to continue being taken. The result was devastating for them in the best possible way. They had to face their consequences, and I had to find a gentler joy. If you're listening, and you are tired of being the person who mends everybody else while your own seams are fraying, know this: you can choose peace. You can choose to stop carrying everyone else's meals on your shoulders. It doesn't mean you become unkind. It means you protect the space that lets you be kind without being consumed. I still cook for those I love who love me back, and for the women at the shelter whose gratitude is like a balm. I still set a table sometimes, but I no longer set myself on fire to keep others warm. When family asks now, if they ask with respect, with true apology and willingness to change, I will open my door. Until then, I will sit on my porch, sip my coffee, breathe in the smell of rosemary from the garden I planted for myself, and smile. Protecting my peace tastes better than any meal, and the table I set for myself is finally full. Thank you for listening. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Are you ready to protect your peace too?